Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I can't tell you what honor is a cheap word, thrill is too sexual a word, but what an occasion it is for me to have a chance to sit in person with Edward St. Aubyn. During the pandemic, we did a conversation for the Y, long distance, with Teddy, as his friends call him, in London, and me on East 88th Street. And yet somehow it worked much better than it will tonight because we'd seen. I admire Edward St. Aubyn extravagantly. We were joking before we came out tonight that it is possible, and St. Aubyn is an instance of this, to be a hugely ambitious author who is not crazily competitive. But it is not possible for a Jewish American author, I think, not to be crazily competitive. And certainly I always feel that way when I pick up somebody else's book. I have the residual sense that the whole writing thing is pretty well covered, right, by one author. We don't need a lot more. Then I pick up Edward St. Aubyn's writing, and I never fail to be astonished and knocked sideways by the density of wit, metaphor, poetic invention that fills every page. I was thinking as I was reading his latest book, Parallel Lines, that he is something of the P.G. Wodehouse of woe. That like Wodehouse, there's scarcely a page that doesn't have three striking turns of phrase or metaphors on it. And yet, where most writers with that kind of poetic delight in and shimmer in their work tend to turn to, if not the lighter, then at least the more festive subjects. St. Aubyn uses that gift in the most extraordinary counterpoint with the darkest subjects known to man, child abuse and addiction in the extraordinary Patrick Melrose series, and now in this new series, which has no name but unites a cast of characters, the ever heart-lifting subject of death, which is death and apocalypse, which are sort of the two central subjects of this book. I thought just to start off, I would read a little bit from the novel, and I'll read something very slightly surprising, I think. You know, Jean Cocteau once said that we should look at whatever our critics say is the worst thing in our writing, and then focus on that and do nothing else, because it's the one part of our writing that's actually original, is whatever critics single out as not. And Teddy has an extraordinary horizontal mind that leads him from one to the most wonderful digressions, and critics who prefer taut, kind of Len Dayton sort of prose say, oh, we shouldn't have as many digressions, but the digressions are part of the extraordinary joy of the book, in part because they are little essays on broader political and contemporary subjects. Here's one that I particularly like. It's about psychoanalysis and the Bush family. And talking about how George Bush the First was actually this unimaginable war hero of a kind we still don't fully appreciate. Most of his crew were captured, tortured, and executed by the Japanese. Of the other two men in his own plane, one was burnt alive, and the other wore a parachute that never opened. Bush, Sr., swam through the water, bleeding from his forehead, and being stung by so many jellyfish that he was vomiting uncontrollably by the time he climbed into a lifeboat and was picked up by an American submarine. After that, he was demobilized, covered in medals. George W., by contrast, avoided the Vietnam War by joining the Texas Air National Guard. Buzzing around Texan airspace, said Francis, must have drastically reduced his chances of being shot down by anti-aircraft fire and bailing out over shark-infested waters. Mind you, with the gun laws in Texas, you never know. You can probably pick up an air defense system at Walmart in El Paso. I wouldn't be surprised, said Lizzie. But my point is that Bush bought his exemption from Vietnam at the price of feeling less potent than his father. When he was magically transformed from draft dodger into commander-in-chief, he was strongly motivated to show that he was a greater warrior than his father by going all the way to Baghdad. His father had stopped short of conquering Baghdad because he was not a fantasy warrior and knew the real cost of war. He also stopped short of Baghdad because the mission of the first Gulf War, getting Iraq out of Kuwait, had been accomplished. When George W. dressed up like an airman, just like his pa, on board an aircraft carrier, the same type of vessel from which his father had flown into combat, and stood under the orgasmic banner, "Mission Accomplished," the mission in question was taking place in his unconscious mind. He had proved that even if he couldn't be a hero in the Second World War or in the Vietnam War, he could be the hero of the Second Gulf War. He could invent the entire thing. Back in the real world, nothing at all had been accomplished. On the contrary, a long, illegal, unnecessary, destabilizing, and unsuccessful war had just been launched. "Cooey," said Olivia. "Freud didn't live in vain." The culmination of the great unconscious war, said Lizzie, was that George W. had 2 terms as president, making him twice as big a man as his relatively brave, well-informed, and sober father. My case rests. And my minestrone has arrived. Thank you. I can't imagine a better 1.5-page history of Bush père and fils and a justification of a psychoanalytic understanding of their behavior.
Yes, it's in a chapter, the most explicitly political chapter, chapter 6, in which the Goldwater rule is remembered, because an article was written about Barry Goldwater called "The Unconscious of a Conservative." And legitimately, in a way, he sued the author, saying, "What do you know about my unconscious?" And, but in it, lots of professional psychiatrists and psychotherapists have said that Goldwater was a dangerous man. And after that, the American Psychiatric Association made the Goldwater rule, in which no professional psychotherapist could comment on a public figure, which is a tragedy, because they're the most qualified people to do so. And so during that chapter, there's an advocacy for having at least 500 hours of psychoanalysis before you're given the code to the nuclear launch. Because, I
can't resist, because that chapter also has a beautiful mini essay on not only on American malfunction and dysfunction, but on British malfunction and dysfunction, based on the idea that what goes wrong in Britain is whenever people from Eton School are put in power.
That's right.
And Francis says here, apart from all that, said Francis, isn't this sort of national decline of the kind that Britain is going through right after Brexit, and the book is situated, isn't this sort of national decline just what happens when we have Etonian prime ministers? Eden and Macmillan gave us the Suez Crisis and the Profumo affair. Cameron and Johnson have given us Brexit and Partygate. The public demanded a long pause before entrusting the country to Etonians again, but when they did, it turned out that nothing much had changed. The international fuck-ups were based on the same arrogance and exaggeration of Britain's autonomy, and the scandals on the same combination of self-indulgence and mendacity. Said Lizzie, it's not a school that teaches its students to run the world. It teaches them to feel entitled to run the world. Could be applied to various American schools as well. But I did want to talk to you, Teddy. That is one of the most distinct features of your book, which I should add also unfolds a beautiful and complicated family story. But you don't evade the opportunity to write a mini essay or to have your characters articulate their thoughts on politics, the passing scene. It's a particular kind of, it's always seemed to me, kind of British tradition, comes very much out of writers like Peacock and Aldous Huxley, a philosophical novel as much as a psychological novel.
I think Double Blind, its predecessor, was much more explicitly a novel of ideas.
Yes.
In this one, you've chosen the most argumentative, although there is a very bitchy passage about Lacan.
Yes, I was going to read that next.
Oh, good, great. No, but there are less explicit ideas. I've tried to embody the ideas which are raised in Double Blind more and more in the drama of the characters' lives, and that's going to continue with the third volume, which is called Convergence. I go from a two-word titles to a single-word title in the search for unity, and it may be the only unity I can find, is to end with a one-word title.
Although one of the beautiful things in the book is that one of the protagonist in the sense, Olivia, name, which is, I have a great affection for, is simultaneously dealing with death and tragedy, and she is putting together a series, a radio series, a television series on approaching apocalypses, which give you wonderful opportunities for a peculiar kind of black comedy.
That's right. She's right. She's doing a series of 6 programs about the 6 ways most likely to...
We're all going to die.
End the world, yes. And there's a lot of confusion and competition. There are so many candidates. But they finally choose the finalists for this competition. But by the end of the book, she's about to work on 6 programs called Solutions.
Yes, yes.
So
I was holding that back.
There's a sense of balance, I think you think that these books are about destruction, death, and extinction, but they're also about healing and regeneration, and there's a central setting called Haworth, which is blatantly stolen from a place called Knepp, which is a rewilding centre in Sussex.
A rewilding centre?
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, it's a place where nature has been allowed to let go, and they've put in surrogates for the animals that would have been in Britain before it became overrun by human beings. So there are longhorn cattle and there are Tamworth pigs and so forth, standing in for various creatures which would disrupt the otherwise solidly forest Britain that we allegedly had. That was the previous theory, that squirrels could have run from branch to branch, from Land's End to John O'Groats. But this theory is outdated because these animals would have knocked down the trees or eaten the bark and so forth. And so they've replicated that at Knepp, and I have a place in the novel where that's going on, called Haworth. So it's about that, but you can't have healing without having illness. Yes. You can't have regeneration without having degeneration. So you're right, they go hand in hand. You've concentrated naturally on the bleak side of things.
Yes, of course, that's my...
But there is someone with schizophrenia.
I can't imagine why we would have a tropism at this moment in history for the bleak, alarming, and politically charged. But having indulged my own love of the philosophical and political digressions that so winningly fill your writing, I do think that this book is particularly striking for the characterizations of, I can't think of a better word. Would you talk a little bit about the people in this book? Think particularly of Olivia and Sebastian, 2 Shakespearean names who have somewhat Shakespearean connection.
They do. They're twins who were separated at birth and who reunite in their 40s, having led very, very different lives. And Sebastian is schizophrenic, which creates all sorts of verbal opportunities, but he's speaking in schizophrenies. I read up about schizophrenia, and there are lots of schizophrenics who say nothing at all. I decided that perhaps I wouldn't put one of those in my novel. And then there are those who speak in schizophrenies. So in both cases, they have a very urgent communication to make, but it's also an impossible communication because they feel they'll be punished or destroyed if they make it. And so in one case, they remain silent, which is the option I went against. In another, they talk in code. And so to some extent, when Sebastian is in charge of the narrative, the reader is in the same position as a therapist. They're trying to decipher this code that he's speaking in, which is very heavy in symbol and metaphor and association. He's got a very, very strongly associative, very suggestible mind.
And that's how we begin the book, actually.
That's how it begins,
in his presence, and we have to figure out what this relationship is.
Exactly.
And what the situation is.
I throw you in at the deep end.
Yes.
It's true. So persist, please, beyond the first chapter. And then Olivia is his twin, who was brought up by an almost impossibly sane family, and is very, very stable and happy, and living with an eco-warrior in the rewilding centre. So they're very, very different people, and yet they find a loyalty and a bond between them when they finally meet. And they realise that...
Despite having a very St. Aubyn mother.
Yes, they have a very disappointing real mother, biological mother, but they're both adopted. And they realise that they once shared a womb. And I suppose, that in a sense, metaphorically, the questions raised in Double Blind are then being acted out by this drama. Is it possible that some of the things we insist on separating and dividing and putting against each other, mind and body, or arts and sciences and so forth, actually share a common ground? And should we be looking for that common ground in a world which is so riddled with fragmentation and split consciousness, and societies that are at war with each other, and people are at war with themselves, and people are at war with each other, and ideas, and how much are these ideas responsible for that alienation and for that split consciousness? So I suppose that's the ideas are set out in Double Blind, and now through the metaphor of the twins separated at birth, I'm going more deeply into whether there is some womb.
Yes. I will say too that Olivia, again, I have an enormous affection for the name because, as Teddy knows, it's the name of my daughter. It's a beautifully realized character. She's almost like a Jane Austen heroine in a sense, because she's a reservoir of sense in the middle of a largely schizophrenic world, not just schizophrenic brother, but as a schizophrenic world.
Absolutely. She's got tremendous sanity, but considered generosity.
Yes.
It's not impetuous generosity, which will then generate regret or exhaustion. It's very considered. And her decision to include her brother in her life is, I think, is very carefully managed, and more moving as a result.
Yes, it is kind of the moral mainspring of the book, and exactly because she doesn't do it in the spirit of a sentimental embrace at all, but as a conscious series of choices that she makes.
Yes.
It's particularly moving. Granted that the book is very much about renewal and beginning again, there is also carried over from the first volume illness and attitudes towards death. There's a beautiful section. One of my favorite short passages is where the mystic in the book talks about how we have to welcome death the way we welcome a visitor. When we have a visitor coming to stay with us, we don't say alert the police. We say welcome to the room. And he says something similar about our attitude towards mortality.
Yes, Father Guido. Indeed. Were you going to read Lacan, did you say? The Lacan bit?
I will read the...
I'm so excited you chose.
I will read the Lacan bit. But I do like... but I want to come back to Guido, if I may.
Guido, yes. You see, the trouble with books is that you write them and then 9 months or a year later they're published and you can't remember anything about them. So that's why I created this Lacanian decoy.
You're trying to remember which one is
Olivia. I'm quickly going to read a Guido chapter and remind myself what he does.
This is, again, and I don't want to give you an entirely misleading idea of this wonderful book, because it is, in fact, deeply moving and is essentially story of family, mortality, and renewal. Nonetheless, the reflective moments in it are wonderful too. Carmen, a new character, is last patient of the day of Olivia's adopted father, was not fruitful in breakthroughs. Adoptive father, I should say. If only because she had moved to London from California, burdened with what turned out to be a Lacanian analysis. That's Jacques Lacan was one of the most famous psychoanalysts of a peculiarly French school that he founded, and of which I suspect he remained the only member as well. Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic school had eventually had its membership of the International Psychoanalytical Association revoked, and so, strictly speaking, Carmen had not been analyzed at all. But that didn't mean she hadn't been harmed, only if by imagining that she had already been analyzed. The authoritarian obscurity of Lacan's writing, combined with the brutality of his clinical methods, formed a compound that any Borgia would have been thrilled to keep in the hollow of their ruby ring and tip into the goblet of an enemy who was not yet entirely convinced that suicide was the best way forward. This is one of my favorite sentences in the book. His prose, Lacan's, his prose appeared to have been written by an alarmed squid, escaping in a cloud of ink from the terror of not being able to live up to his craving for intellectual greatness. He had no time to waste on the difficulties of his patients when he was so busy creating insurmountable difficulties for his readers. His courte session could last as little as 2 minutes before the tormented Analysand was thrown back into a waiting room crowded with acquaintances, and the next victim was summoned to the Procrustean couch. To Martin, who felt that the regularities and rhythms of analysis provided a cradle in which the patient could safely reconnect with the most primitive parts of their mind, this method was obviously inept and often dangerous. A Lacanian analysis, as Carmen exemplified, was the natural refuge of someone determined to avoid getting better, but hoping to look as if she were trying. If only to sometimes preface her self-centeredness with the phrase, "my therapist says," rather than the naked first-person singular, which would otherwise appear at the beginning or, at the very latest, after a derogatory comparison in the middle of every sentence she uttered. If not quite equivalent to choosing Charles Manson as a spiritual guide, the choice of a Lacanian analyst was a match for any list of charlatan gurus whose sexual predations, fundraising frenzies, and abundance of crazy wisdom turned out to be no substitute for enlightenment, generosity, and sanity. When he had to take on a patient who had survived a Lacanian episode, Martin not only had to interpret the pattern on the vase, which was always the case, but also reassemble the vase from the bag of shards handed to him by his predecessor. I don't know a more beautifully characteristic passage of St. Aubyn prose. And if I may just point out quickly, and at the risk of being a little professorial, that what's beautiful about that section, too, is not just the wit of its approach, but the variety of its sentences. So we have that beautiful aphoristic sentence. His prose appeared to have been written by an alarmed squid, escaping in a cloud of ink from the terror of not being able to live up to his craving for intellectual greatness. And then that very long sort of Proustian sentence about how Lacanian analysis is the natural refuge of someone determined to avoid it, and then which then turns into the naked first-person singular, a much longer measure. And then finally, if I may say, the crazy wisdom of Lacan turned out to be no substitute for enlightenment, generosity, and sanity. And it struck me when I was reading this passage, Teddy, that those three words and those three values are the core of your values as they're expressed in your fiction. Enlightenment, generosity, and sanity. Those are the three things your people search for, reach for.
That's right. And I think Olivia, as you already mentioned, embodies that, but also Martin, her father. And one of the tough things about writing this book was taking on the subject of kindness, which I think is an underexplored subject because it's so difficult to write about in an interesting way. And even Shakespeare ran into trouble with Cordelia, who notoriously has many fewer lines than her appalling sisters who rattle on for ages. And he didn't know what good people say, you know. And if you're reading Bleak House, you get to Esther's diary, you think, oh, maybe I could skip this, and you could get back to a lurid murder, or a fog-bound city, or a pub full of debtors, and it's very difficult to write about kindness, and at the same time, it's the thing we all care about most, you know, and but it's underrepresented, I think, in literature. Kindness is usually attributed to a character who's going to turn out to be a hypocrite, who's actually cruel. Then it's all right, you know, it's all right for them to have been kind.
Like Mr. Skimpole.
Yeah, like Mr. Skimpole, exactly. So that was one of the challenges of the book, is how to deal with kindness.
Well, it's fascinating that you say that, because one of the things I was thinking about, and it's somewhat of a curveball, so I wanted to throw at you, is that in all of your books, but particularly in this one, religious mysticism, psychoanalysis is presented sympathetically, which is unusual in 2025, but religious mysticism is presented sympathetically as well. And I wonder if there's a part of you that's sort of drawn towards the monastic life, or some variant of it, not for religious reasons, not for superstitious reasons, but because it seems like a place where one can pursue kindness with dignity.
Yes, I suppose that's true. I hadn't really thought of it. There is a monstrous Catholic, Cardinal Lagerfeld,
yes,
who is, and I felt, for the sake of balance, that I had to have a good Catholic in Father Guido. But I think there's something about his I think I haven't thought about this before. I'm making this up as I go along, but that's how I write anyway. There's a connection in that, in his silent retreat, he suddenly finds himself on an equal plane with the rest of reality, instead of being this soul-sensitive subject in a world of objects, some of which you hesitantly attribute an equal center of self to, and then they fall away quite rapidly into the inanimate. And it's not like that for him. Suddenly he's on this equal plane. And also, I mean, I went on several silent retreats, and there is a connection with analysis, in the sense that projection just fell away after a certain. I realized that the whole traffic of my mind was projection and introjection. You know, the things which.
By projection, meaning.
Meaning that you're attributing your own feelings to someone else, and introjection, that you're imagining that they're thinking about you, what you're thinking about them, and so forth. That once that traffic dies down, everything becomes hilariously funny, and you feel much kinder. You know, your heart opens up. So you're not so busy having these fantasies about what's going on in other people's minds. You know, it falls away. And in a way, analysis is trying to help you dismantle those things in a much more deconstructive, slow process. But by staying silent for a while, and it becomes obvious that that's what's really going on, and it's a huge relief.
It's fascinating. So we won't lose you like Graham Greene to Catholicism, but we may lose you to mysticism. We may lose you to a monastery.
No, you're not going to lose me to a monastery. I'm sitting here for the rest of my life, speaking in public. That's my.
Your fate.
But I haven't done that for a while. But there is great value in silence, which is it's hard to notice.
But that idea haunts the book, though, as well. The idea that a retreat away from what the Buddhists call monkey mind is a necessary part of the self-education.
Yes, absolutely. And but I give that aspect of things to Father Guido. He's a very sort of touching, adorable man. he's naively good, you know, he's kind in another way. He really does believe that love, you know, love is the objective, and that it's self-renewing rather than something which you stingily hand out and keep as much of for yourself as possible. You know, he really thinks the more you give away, the more you get. You know?
Well, what's beautiful about it is this is completely persuasive as a character. You don't feel that he's a Dostoevskian divine fool who's flown into these pages. He's totally. He sounds like a complete person.
I don't know where I got him. I've never met him.
Oh, you don't have him in real life?
No, there's no basis for him. He just popped up.
Teddy, I know most of the people in the audience will know you, though, are catching up on these last two books, and will know you best from the Patrick Melrose series, right, which were an enormous success here in America in every way, critically, and the ultimate accolade turned into a series.
Yeah.
What was your experience of that, of the response to those books? I know that the question of what led you to them is infinitely complex. But were you startled, surprised, pleased, dismayed?
It was very gradual. And for 14 years, I only had about 1,500 readers, and I knew most of their first names. You know, and then there was a short listing for the Booker Prize, and then I got published in America, and then in 30 or 40 countries or something. Everything exploded. But I'd known what it was like to be completely neglected for a long time, and then gradually less neglected. And then when the film series, the television series was made, there was another level of attention given to them. So I think I'm lucky in a way that it took so long. So I started the first sentence of Nevermind in 1988, and I wrote the first chapter. I was just a kid, you know, and I just thought, this is too difficult, you know, it's just too emotionally difficult to write this. And I stopped.
To recapture that past.
I just thought, I can't write, it's too upsetting. I just found it too upsetting. And then a year later, exactly a year later, I started the second chapter and then wrote the whole thing. But I couldn't even look at the page when I was writing it. I kind of wrote like this and then posted it over my shoulder.
Truly. And you were writing longhand.
I was writing longhand like that and dripping with sweat, so it was smudged. It was almost illegible. And then I had a girlfriend who'd pick up the pages that I threw over my shoulder, and I could hear typing next. So I knew that real activity, real writing was taking place because of the click of the typewriter in the room.
That could be the subject of a Max Beerbohm drawing, right? And Wade St. Aubyn throws the pages over his shoulder.
And they didn't have cut and paste in those days. It weren't computers. But I did get a pair of scissors and then some sellotape and stick together.
You cut and pasted.
I cut and pasted. So I found the sentences that worked and cut them out, and then I stuck them to the next sentence that worked. So the reception was very slow, but what was lucky, I suppose, was that some people who I really respected, some very good writers, encouraged me right from the beginning. So although there was a tiny number, there was high quality. Yes. So I believed them.
And
in a way, those books are about cruelty. They're about a spectacularly unhappy family, and these books, in many ways, look like the opposite. You know, they're about a happy family and they're about kindness, but. but there are also similarities as well as being these very obvious differences, you know.
Yes, these are recuperative books in a way that those were not, in fact.
And they include the psychoanalysis, which isn't in the Melrose.
In that too.
Some of the solutions, just like Olivia is working on solutions, having worked on her series about extinction, you know. This is my solutions to the extinction of the Melrose.
But in another way, if I may, Teddy, though the tragedies in these last two books are less overt in a certain sense, right? Abuse and addiction. They're even deeper because they're about death and extinction and how we can deal with those true facts in a relatively, I hate to use the word healthy, but in a relatively sane and generous way.
Yes, I think all of the they're much larger problem. There's something very exotic and strange about the Melroses. I mean, a sort of incestuous, almost infantile paedophilia. You know, it's just it's quite unusual. I'm glad to say. I hope it is. Whereas cancer is, we're up to 1 in 2, aren't we?
Yes.
And mental illness is more and more commonplace. So I'm dealing with more universal problems, and not with the problem of a particular upbringing, a particular class, a particular, you know, this very extreme situation described in the Melroses, but a kind of indoctrination that we've all had about how to think about the world. This subject-object relationship, this mind-body problem, this, you know, this choice you have to make. I mean, your education in America is much more enlightened than ours, but English school children are asked at 15 as if they would know the answer, you know, to choose between
what life they want.
The humanities and the sciences, and they either put on a white lab coat or they get covered in ink. And, you know, it's an absurd choice to have to make at 15, as if knowledge was divided in such a neat and silly way.
Yes. We put our kids through the equally absurd torment of college admissions. Then we put it off for 4 years, and then they rediscover it. Yes, in some ways, this book, Parallel Lines, and its predecessor are in a certain way. It seemed to me reading it in, you should forgive the expression, more bourgeois novels in a sense.
Yeah.
That they come from a middle class setting rather than the aristocratic setting of the Melrose books.
Yes, everything is more accessible and more general and more universal, including this intellectual indoctrination and educational indoctrination we've all been given. And yeah, the Melroses are a very bizarre family. So I was very surprised by the reception. To answer your earlier question, I was very surprised by something so strange acquiring this what popularity it's about. Yeah. I mean, but in a way, at this point, it's 15 years since the last one was published, and I think what strikes me now is it's not their literary qualities, it's the extra literary qualities. It's people coming up to me and saying, you know, that they used to feel ashamed or isolated, and they read the book and it made a difference there. You know, if they say they're elegant or something, you know,
You're past that.
I'm not as excited as I am when the sense that they've reduced somebody's suffering, I find very moving. Those are the letters that I cherish rather than them.
That's beautifully said. Do you mean people who also have some possibly very different primal shame or some...
Exactly. Some trauma or some problems with addiction. The idea... it's because I never set out to do it. I think it's a surprise that they've reduced someone's suffering. It's a kind of completely unexpected benefit Whereas I did set out to make them elegant and all of that. So that's less surprising, although it took a long time for people to notice.
But isn't that, in a certain sense, exactly how we distinguish literature from non-literature, from journalism and criticism and everything else? Exactly, is that it can take a seemingly aberrant experience and universalize it and make it make it seem shared.
Yes, that's right. But
one might not have known that an experience that particular would become that. So we have questions from our wonderful audience. Someone asks, the Melrose novels, excuse me, I'm of that age, the Melrose novels were brilliant dissections of English class, as we've been discussing. In these new novels, class feels less a focus. Just what we've been talking about. It's that because, this is, but now asking a better question than I did on the same subject, is that because class feels less urgent to you today?
Yes, it feels, it's of no interest to me at all now. It's strange. I think it's really because my father was obsessed with class, and that's why the Melroses are saturated with class consciousness, and he just talked complete rubbish all the time about. He said things like there are only 400 families that matter. I mean, what would that mean? You know, where's the list? You know, why?
If I can have a mildly psychoanalytic moment, wouldn't an analyst actually say that evidences enormous insecurity about his own class position?
It was all nonsense, and yes, oddly enough.
Well,
a member of my family just wrote a book about my family called it's called Saints and Sinners. You know, how one family survived 1,000 years. And all families have survived 1,000 years. It's kind of, I mean, or otherwise, you know, we really have missed out on. My studies of science have been in vain. Some just sort of popped into existence 300 years ago. But you know, that sort of drivel, you know,
yes. Was part of it.
Was part of it, and it doesn't. It really, it's been a long detox, you know, because it was such a strong poison and it was such a strong indoctrination. But it now doesn't interest me at all. Is it
still a toxin in British public life, as the little section I read about the old Etonians in British public policy suggests?
Yes, less and less so. There's so much. The people who are owning the country remain the same, but the people that run the country are completely different. And so there's been this divergence between ownership and rulership, which means that at least 50% of the power of the upper class is dissolved. And anyway, you know, it's dissolved within itself, even in terms of ownership. So the whole thing has been diluted. You know, the value of an English duke relative to sort of, you know,
a Russian oligarch.
A Russian oligarch or a rapper, you know, has just goes so far down the scale. You know, you have to get your binoculars out to see them. Oh, a duke, you know. Like, whereas when I was brought up, they were quite, you know, quite a big deal. Yeah. No, they don't matter at all.
Was that an act of self-emancipation on your part? That feeling?
Well, I was helped along by history, yeah, and the complete abolition of the House of Lords, for instance. You know, they would. There's no the hereditary peers are the most disenfranchised people on the planet. They can't go into the House of Commons or the House of Lords. They just can't go anywhere. They just have to wander the streets, muttering to themselves. And,
with their coronets slanted.
It's pathetic.
Someone asks, do you think you've got a typical British sense of humor?
Wow. I think there's something about the concentricity, if you like, of Britain, or how it appears to be concentric and conventional and insular, the right little tight little island, all of that side of England. And formally it's class consciousness, and it's concerned with doing the right thing and appearances and so forth, led to an explosion of eccentricity. It inevitably produced the opposite. So that's the sparks flying from the wheel, you know, the sort of protest against that concentricity. So in that sense, I think Britain is, it does produce a lot of comedy because a lot of comedy is made out of incongruity. So you've got to have an idea of what congruity is, a very strong idea of what congruity is, in order to rebel against it. So I think in that sense, I am typical. What else do we typically do? We loathe sincerity, whereas you have a cult of sincerity.
Yes.
And so, you know, sincerity is a compliment in America, as far as I can make out, whereas, you know, it would be it's an insult.
It's a withering insult.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, it was an
so sincere, you know, exactly. So in that sense, there's the addiction to irony, which is mentioned by Patrick Melrose in he says, forget heroin, try giving up irony. You know, the desire to be in two places at once. You know, because that's what irony is. It's hedging your bets, saying one thing and meaning another, and this
which allows you to retreat back.
Which allows you to retreat. It allows you to say, you know, I didn't really mean it. I was only joking. That thing, or you know, there's this British phrase which I loathe, which is sense of humour failure. What you do is you're sadistic. And then when someone doesn't laugh, you accuse them of a sense of humour failure, you know. And so a lot of things have been done under the cover of wanting to be in two places
We do
at once.
just the opposite. When someone says something that we judge, we say, that's not funny.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't say sense of humor failures. No, that's not funny.
Yes, no.
Let me make that question a little more pointed and tiresomely pedantic. Are there British what we think of as comic novelists or comic writers who you responded to as a young reader? I'm thinking of Amos Senior, for instance, Kingsley and...
Amos Senior meant nothing to me. And I mean, I tried reading Lucky Jim, which was reputedly, you know, his great work, and I just gave it up. But I mean, Martin was a huge influence on my generation, and he was a brilliant comic writer. I mean, I don't write like him at all, but he was definitely, you know, the man for a young.
We've never talked about that, Teddy. It's and much missed and now gone.
Yeah.
Was it that, in a certain sense, Martin unlocked reservoirs of self-conscious prose, Nabokov and Bellow and so on, in a literary culture that was inclined to say, "Oh, come off," if anybody tried to write well in that way?
Exactly. I think England had become very miniaturist and provincial under his father, and that Martin was trying to bust out. And he spent quite a long time in America, which I think had a big influence on him. And the idea of writing a big novel, you know,
like London
that America, and that, and also kind of hostility to his. He loved Nabokov and he loved Bellow, as you say, and so he really wanted to, and Kingsley used to complain.
Deprovincialize.
Deprovincialize, emphasize style, and also take on ambitious subject matter. But he went back again and again to the same basic engine, which is male competitiveness, and that's what became the limitation. So but he had a big ambition. He had a huge intellect. I went to dinner once at his house, and he said, "What are you reading?" And I said, "Oh, I'm rereading Paradise Lost." He said, "Which book?" And I said, "Oh, the 7th book or something." And then he said, "Where are you in it?" I said, "About the middle." And then he quoted 4 pages of Paradise Lost from well, I sat, having already forgotten the entire thing, drinking my whiskey nervously,
Saying that's the one about the devil, the devil, right?
Unbelievable.
That's a wonderful story.
Intellectually, he was astonishing, and some of his sentences are dazzling, but I always felt that limitation of the. I loved Experience though, and Money, London Fields. There's some great books. So I think he was the great writer, I suppose.
He showed the way for a whole generation. As I say, too.
Lots of people tried to imitate him in a very, direct way.
Well, it's his memory, etc. Someone asks here, what books or authors do you turn to while writing these new novels? Maybe just spread it. What books or authors do you read most?
Well, I don't read other fiction because I'm too anxious by nature and too permeable. And if I read something, I start writing like it. I'm immediately impressed and think, oh, why aren't I writing about, the Battle of Borodino or whatever, I just, so I avoid fiction when I'm writing fiction. And particularly these books, and particularly Double Blind, was very researched. So I read lots and lots of non-fiction, all of which I
biology,
biology
ecology,
and genetics, ecology, and so forth, and all of which I've forgotten. But I did, I've only used about 2% of what I read. But I wanted it to. I had an autodidact's anxiety, that I would attack a straw man or make a stupid mistake, and so I read and read and read, but not fiction. So I've tended to read fiction in the pauses between writing fiction. Then I go back. Usually I go back to things I either neglected, masterpieces, or things that I read when I was absurdly young, like I reread The Magic Mountain, which I'd read at 17 or something. I just thought, I can't really have made sense of this, And so I'd go back because I was very ambitious in my reading when I was a teenager, but I don't think I had any idea what the books were about.
That's the nicest thing about reading as a teenager. Simply, it soaks in through your skin. It doesn't go through your brain.
So I do that.
What you said, neglected masterpieces. What's on your list of neglected masterpieces?
I can't remember the last time I had an excursion into fiction. I read a lot of Turgenev. I remember doing that and being very taken with him. And
Fathers and Sons in there.
And Resurrection I'd never read. I'd read War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and Resurrection. And the idea that fiction is didactic, it's obviously less interesting or less artistic and so forth. I loved Resurrection; it was brilliant. And sometimes I would have themes like memoir, and read everything from Augustine to sort of Gore Vidal's Palimpsest or whatever. I'd just read a particular genre, for a while, and then I'd feel the itch to write a novel, and I'd stop reading.
Stop reading fiction.
Or
anything. Or
yeah.
We're sadly running short of time, but let me ask you one last question from the audience, then I have a question of my own. The characters in Double Blind seem to have made their way to parallel lines. One shrewd reader knows. Do you envision a set along the lines of the Patrick Melrose novels?
Absolutely. And the Patrick Melrose novels were 5 50,000-word novels. That was my chosen length.
Both the 5 and the 50.
The 50 was as much as I could manage. This is going to be 3 times 83, which will come to 250,000 words. So they're going to be exactly equally weighted. That's the intention. And I'm working on the third one, the one-word titled one called Convergence, in which Sebastian takes over completely. So instead of the metaphor of the twins meeting and speculating about their shared womb, it's really about the most fragmented character of all coming together, becoming integrated and becoming whole.
Eager to experience it.
So
Let me ask you.
I have no idea how I'm going to bring that up. Anyway.
We need. Speaking of integrated characters, we live in a time, and though this is, as I say, is not far from being a political novel, nonetheless, it looks squarely at the world as it is. What's in this time of pervasive crisis and of every imaginable sort, in your country and in ours? What's the function of writing? What's the function, I don't mean of journalism, what's the function of the novel? I know that. What's the function of what do you want to bear witness to, and what gives you confidence, if you have any, that it matters?
I think we're really back to basics with that. This is not the high point of the genre, but it is holding a mirror up to nature and telling stories in prose. I don't think that'll ever die out. I don't. For me, privately, the function of the big series that I've done, both the Melroses and these books, is some kind of jailbreak. I feel intolerably imprisoned by some kind of conditioning, and I have to find the way out. So it's a kind of escape. It's the great escape. I'm Charles Bronson digging the tunnel, collapsing on me. I've got claustrophobia. It's like it feels like that. And also, I want to write about something that I don't yet understand. It's quite different from declaration. It's not like I know the answer. I don't know what I'm going to do in Convergence. How the hell am I going to integrate this disintegrated character? So I have to be discovering something that I don't understand yet. So those are the two: the jailbreak and the discovery are the two things that motivate me, rather than feeling that I want to buttonhole people to tell them something that I'm sure of. I'm not sure of anything,
And there's, yes, as Woodhouse says, humanity will remain a message short. In that way. Teddy, I can't thank you enough, and I know I speak on behalf of the audience. You may see yourself as Charles Bronson digging a tunnel. We all see you as Steve McQueen doing pirouettes on a motorcycle as you make your escape. Thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Adam, what a great guy.
I hope you pick up your books, which are already signed, I believe.
Yes,
right,
they are.
And that too. And thank you so much for joining us, and do join us again for some of the wonderful occasions that Lucas outlined at the beginning. Thank you again. Have a good evening.
Thanks.